Hi, you're watching DNA Today, a multi-award winning genetics podcast where we explore everything to do with genetics, from CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. We have won the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for many years now. We have hundreds of episodes, and we really hope you enjoy these conversations where we dive into so many genetic concepts. I'm Kira Deneen, a certified genetic counselor, and your host. We are exploring an important issue in healthcare in this episode, diversifying genetic research. To discuss this, I'm joined by two experts from 23andMe. Dr. Ruth Tennen is a product scientist at 23andMe. In this role, Dr. Tennen develops new genetic health reports with the goal of helping 23andMe customers access, understand, and benefit from the human genome. Dr. Anjali Shastri is a senior program manager at 23andMe. A research scientist by training, she manages programs that increase access to genetic testing, improve representation in genomic studies, and further impactful genetic research. Think like 23andMe's 1 million participant COVID-19 study, which I'm sure I've mentioned on the show because I'm familiar with it. So that more people can benefit from 23andMe's health and ancestry products, services, and research. So thank you both so much for joining me for a topic that we mention a lot on the show in terms of diversifying genetic research, but I'm like, we haven't had enough episodes dedicated to it. So I'm really excited for this much needed conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So I thought we could start with just what changes you both have observed in recent years with diversifying genetic research. We've had this show for almost 11 years now. Maybe 11 years by the time this episode comes out, in September possibly. But in those years, I would say in the past 4 or 5 years, there's been much more of a push for diversifying genetic research. Dr. Tennen, we could start with you of just your thoughts on this. Is this similar viewpoint that you have? Would you change that answer?
So I'm actually going to throw this one over to Anjali because she's absolutely the expert on this topic, if that's okay.
Okay. Yes. Love it. Love the teamwork.
Perfect.
Here. Yes.
Oh, thanks, Kira, and thanks, Ruth. Definitely, you are an expert as well. I think I'd say, just sort of stepping back, and your listeners will know this, that, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the completion of the Human Genome Project, which really was like a truly large international collaborative effort. It mapped and sequenced the human genome for the first time. And, despite this accomplishment, we've only really scratched the surface of everything that there is to know about what makes us different at, the level of our DNA. And I think, as you alluded to, one gap that currently exists is in representation. So I think your audience will be familiar with GWAS studies, which are customarily done in genetics. So this is a genome-wide association study. 80% of participants in GWAS studies, which really fuel a lot of our genetic discoveries, are of European ancestry. And of course, we know that that doesn't reflect the global population. And so I think, this speaks to the fact that historically, people who have provided their DNA for genomics research have overwhelmingly been of European ancestry. And that creates pretty large gaps in our knowledge about the genomes from people around the rest of the world. So this is something that I'm personally really passionate about, and I'm very excited. I totally agree with your statement. In the last few years, scientists have really focused their efforts on expanding data collection to better and extending engagement to better understand sort of how genomics can be used to increase, to really improve the health and well-being of all people. And it's something that 23andMe has also prioritized over the last many years. And I think, just name a couple of examples. The All of Us project that's funded by the National Institutes of Health really seeks to broaden and diversify participation in genetics research. And then, one particularly exciting recent example is the NHGRI funded Human Pangenome Reference, which just came out, which is really exciting because it brings together sequences, as you might know, from in this case 47 people of different ancestries, and really more significantly captures population diversity than any previous reference genome.
Yeah, that one's very exciting. I think that got on my radar last year. And we had Dr. Eric Green on our recap of the year episode. And that's something that we talked about in terms of what were the biggest projects and things ongoing or like that started last year in 2022. So yeah, very, very exciting that there's now an importance on this. And I think it's interesting and makes sense of 23andMe to kind of be one of the leaders in this space, because you guys have a massive database in terms of how many people have, spit in the tubes and send it off, and just how much data you're able to look at there, and from so many different people that come from different areas of the world. And I think that's very important, Dr. Shastri, that you were saying of that, especially the field started with really only exclusively looking at European genomes, and now we are really moving on from that. But the roots of our field and a lot of the research come from that, and I think that's something that we need to be very aware of. And you brought up a good topic of the importance of increasing the amount of diversity in genetic research and the impact it can have on improving healthcare outcomes. So sometimes I feel like a lot of conversations about diversity is about, yes, this is important, but I like to drive home, well, why is it important? That kind of part two of the answer. So Dr. Tennen, I don't know if you wanted to jump in now or who wants to take it. I'll let you guys decide, because you know each other better than I do. But just like, what is part of that part two? Because I mean, that's what we're going to talk about for the remainder of the episode. But like, what comes to mind for you of talking about improving healthcare outcomes because of diversifying our research?
Yeah. So I can think of, a couple examples there. So one is kind of the importance of understanding like different things that you might be at risk for. So like having access to genetic testing that can then make you informed about things that you might need to pay attention to. So thinking about disparities, for example, we know that Black Americans are about 40% more likely to die from breast cancer than white Americans. And that's a huge disparity. There's all sorts of contributing factors, but we also know that African Americans are less likely to access genetic testing for BRCA1 and BRCA2 and other cancer genetic tests. And so you can think of kind of increasing access to that genetic testing and all of the research required to kind of be able to classify those genetic variants and give people meaningful information from those tests is something that could maybe potentially be one contributor toward kind of reducing those sorts of disparities. Another example that I think is really cool that I learned about recently is this example of PCSK9 inhibitors. So back, I think in 2005 or something, there were scientists who were studying a group of African-American research participants, and they found that these individuals had really low levels of LDL cholesterol, so the bad cholesterol. And they also found that those people had specific genetic variants or mutations in this gene called PCSK9. And so they thought like, oh, this is super interesting. Like there are these variants that disable this gene, and they also lead to low levels of LDL cholesterol. And like, could we come up with a drug that could do the same thing that might be applicable to everyone? And so ultimately they did. They developed these PCSK9 inhibitors that are like very effective medications for lowering cholesterol. And so it kind of is this idea of like, in addition to reducing disparities, there's so much value in studying diverse populations just because there's so much genetic diversity in Africa, right? Like more, Anjali, you know better than I do, but like more than the entire rest of the world combined, and also, tons of genetic diversity elsewhere. So, we're really missing out on making meaningful and like amazing advancements if we don't study all of those different populations.
Yeah, that's a great point, because, we had Dr. Janine Jeff on a few years ago, and she does this awesome podcast that is just so cool. It's called In Those Genes. We'll link to it in the show notes. And one of the things that she brought up was that looking at the African genome and people that come from Africa more directly is really important, because you're getting so much more information than looking at European genomes. And it's almost like, why did we even start with European genomes? To me, it doesn't make sense looking at it now. But I thought that was, it was a really, really great episode. I think people should listen to it after this one. But that's just a great example too of, I remember hearing about this study, we'll link to in the show notes as well, of just learning genetic variants that have this association with a health outcome, I guess, and saying, well, now we can look at developing drugs that will do similar things. So just, basic research is what ends up fueling a lot of things down the line. But then arguing over, the funding for basic research, that's a whole nother level there. And I think we've kind of hit on it, but anything else, Dr. Shastri, to talk about in terms of like how the history of genetic research like impacts today's testing and the differences in care for patients? I mean, another thing I think of is, which maybe we can get to later, or if you have thoughts now, of looking at classifying variants. I mean, that's been something I talk about so much on this show. Of the more genetic data we have, the easier it is to say, this is what this genetic variant means. But yeah, any thoughts in the moment about, along those lines?
Yeah, no, I think would second everything that Ruth talked about, and just that, it feels like we've only just scratched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding human genetic variation and understanding its impact on biology and then subsequently human health. And so, I think one of the topics we wanted to talk about today was sort of what are some of the reasons for those gaps, historic reasons, and I don't know if that's something that you were wanting to talk about, at this time as well. I think, it's something that, is really important to us to understand as we move into this field, to understand why do some of those gaps exist? And I think, it's important to have those in mind and think about them as you're trying to make progress. And so, one of the big things we think about is the lack of trust in research and in research institutions. Among many non-European populations, and particularly amongst the Black and African American community, and I think your listeners would be very familiar with the Tuskegee experiment, the syphilis study, yes. Where care was withheld from individuals for in the name of research, and it's just such a horrific example of research misconduct, and that study didn't end until 1972.
Which is disturbing to hear that it was in the 70s. And we even referenced that on our 250th episode, the Tuskegee studies and just the atrocities there.
Yeah, and I know you've discussed this topic in length in your episodes, but it is such recent history, and it's important to remember that people are still feeling, rightfully so, feeling the impacts of that. And I think, that's maybe the most egregious example, but there's so many other examples of research done without proper informed consent. I know you've spoken at length about, Ms. Henrietta Lacks, yes, and her story. That's one of the most well-known examples, and that was, as your listeners will know, a woman who's had cervical cancer, and her cells were taken and used without her consent for research at Johns Hopkins, and since then they've been used by hundreds of thousands of researchers, fueled, numerous health discoveries, the developments of, drugs, vaccines. And, without her consent and without any really direct benefit to her or her family.
Until recently, I think.
Until recently.
Yes, there you go.
Yeah,
I was are we both thinking it?
Yeah, we're both thinking, yeah. So I think what you might be referring to is that her family recently settled with Thermo Fisher Scientific, and that was in the news, I think, just last week. Yeah. So we're starting to see, to your initial question, we're starting to see a little bit of progress and recognition, but I think we have to understand, anyone who's who's interested in this area of work needs to understand that legacy and really be thoughtful and careful as we approach this work.
Yes, I think that's very, very well said, to understand where we're coming from and learn from our mistakes historically and say, okay, how can we be including people in the research and have them partners in the research and participate, which I think, as we mentioned, one of you did, that the All of Us study, that I think I saw a big shift in terms of how, the government in the United States here and just how people are phrasing things in terms of patients more being an active participant in this research, which I think has just been fabulous. And I think one aspect that I wanted to bring up in terms of, you guys coming through from 23andMe, you have a new collaboration with the Morehouse School of Medicine. And as far as I know, this is the first collaboration in this nature of a genetic testing company and a historically Black medical college pairing up and working together in a partnership. Tell me about this. I mean, how does it improve diversity in research, as we've been talking about, to kind of bring in an application of this actually happening, as opposed to us talking about what we want to see, like you guys are doing this? I don't know who wants to start out there. Dr. Shastri?
Yeah, Kira, maybe I can start, Ruth, and then I'll turn it over to you to talk about some of the improvements that we made to our product.
Sure, yeah.
Part of the collaboration. So yeah, we really started by listening. That was our first step in the spirit of working, in partnership and in collaboration with the community. And so, we spoke to many key opinion leaders, researchers, spoke to many of our own employees, and also did a few studies, so qualitative and quantitative studies, trying to sort of understand people's interest in genetic health information. Is this even something that people in the community are interested in? And then understanding some of the barriers and limitations to their participation. And some of the key themes that emerged were similar to what you were just speaking about in the context of all of us, is the importance of the researchers really listening and engaging, getting feedback, incorporating that feedback. Another was benefit, really providing a concrete benefit to participants that was of value to them. And then choice and transparency. So around choice, that's like choice of how much to participate, right? And that ties in really closely with informed consent, which we'll get into. And then transparency around 23andMe's motivations. Like, what is 23andMe's goal? Why are we pursuing this area of work? And then finally, like education and resources. So actually making sure that people are understanding the information and they're empowered to use it. And so thinking about all of those, putting all of those themes together, we approached Morehouse School of Medicine for a collaboration. And, we spent the first year listening to them and understanding from them their point of view, their perception of the needs, what would be most beneficial. And we've partnered with a number of advocacy groups as well over the past year to sort of support those learnings. And where we landed up is that we decided to launch a sickle cell carrier status awareness program. And the reason we decided to focus on sickle cell carrier status was that sickle cell disease is a condition that is highly prevalent in the Black community in the United States. So it is, as you and I'm sure your audience is aware, the disease has global burden. But in the United States, the prevalence is highest in people of African ancestry. And so it's a genetic disorder. And so it's something where 23andMe, we actually have a genetic report that sickle cell anemia carrier status report that can give people information about their sickle cell carrier status. And in a minute, I'll turn it over to Ruth to give us like all the details there, since she's the author of that fantastic report. But it was something where, it seemed to be a need. It was a relevant condition. 23andMe had something that we could offer to folks to really sort of help raise health awareness, empower people with information about their sickle cell status. And then it's also something that, like, as we spoke with Morehouse School of Medicine colleagues and others, we really found that there was a gap in knowledge. Like there's lack of awareness around whether you are a carrier for sickle cell disease. So whether you have, for sickle cell anemia, whether you have sickle cell trait. And we can get into, if you're interested, like all of the reasons for that. Like we dug really deep into it, but we sort of aligned on this program as a way to provide concrete benefit to participants. And so what we do in the program is that we offer the 23andMe, the full health and ancestry service, free of cost. And as a part of that, people get access to their sickle cell anemia carrier status report. And I'll add one more thing, which is that that report is fantastic. In addition to that, we decided to partner with the Sickle Cell Foundation of Georgia, and they have certified genetic counselors and a ton of other resources to guide people who have sickle cell trait and disease, and really offer them the appropriate resources. And so the way the program was structured was that the pilot of the program involved students, faculty, and staff at Morehouse School of Medicine. They received, if they chose, they received access to the 23andMe Health and Ancestry Service, their sickle cell anemia report, and then they could speak to the foundation, the experts of the foundation. And then, I guess before I turn it over to Ruth, maybe one last thing to add is you asked about research. And so what we chose to do was make research completely optional. And so the rationale there was that people should be able to access the benefit without having to also consent to participate in research. And so that was sort of like the mindset there, and happy to get into that more later. Okay, Ruth, over to you.
Yeah. I don't know, Kira, how much info would be helpful just to talk about the report. I can give a high-level overview, but please jump in with more questions.
No, that sounds great. I've even done 23 myself. Nice. And kind of looked through, and I've looked at my carrier status and nothing identified through 23andMe. I know from other companies, but, you know, I think one aspect that, you know, I liked as a consumer is, you know, it really takes you through, do you want to know this, yes or no, and explaining it. And I think that's very different than what I heard years ago, even, that you guys have made a lot of changes over the years. But that was just kind of what I was thinking about in terms of people going through this process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, that we really want people to be in control of the information we receive, right? So they have to, you know, on our public website, it's super clear. Here's what you'll get if you participate in 23andMe. Once you are a member, you have to opt in to receive your health reports, and then there's special opt-ins for sensitive reports. So we really want to make sure people are getting the info they receive and, you know, totally in control. In terms of the sickle cell anemia carrier status report, we test for the HBS variant in the HBB gene, and we can basically tell you if you have 0, 1, or 2 copies of that variant. If you have 1 copy, we'll tell you like you're a carrier, also known as having sickle cell trait. Here's the implications, you know, for your family, you know, potential reproductive decision making, and then links to how to access advocacy sites, genetic counseling, whether that's, you know, Anjali mentioned the Sickle Cell Foundation of Georgia, but, you know, people may access other types of genetic counseling as well. For people who have 2 copies of the variant, we'll tell them that, you know, they may have a personal risk of developing symptoms of the condition, and then also the implications for their children. And yeah, one really important thing that we recently updated in the report was exactly what Anjali was mentioning is, you know, making sure we're not talking about this as a disease that only impacts the Black and African American community. It impacts people worldwide. In the US, it, you know, has a predominant impact on people with African ancestry, but, you know, we don't want to add to any stigma potentially of the condition, but we also want to alert communities who may not be aware that, you know, they can be impacted, that this is something that they may need to think about.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And just for people, as someone that is a prenatal genetic counselor that is every day offering carrier screening to people, usually when they're already pregnant and ending their first trimester, they're sitting in front of me and I'm like, you know, ideally they would be offered this at their GYN appointment, you know, in their late teens, early 20s, and they would have this information, but that's not what we see. And I think they're very, and I've said this a lot on the show before, there is a time and place for direct consumer testing. Yeah. And this is a little bit different through this study. You know, you're providing a little bit more in terms of someone that's pulling the cart or the kit off the shelf, you know, at different stores or ordering it online. Like, you know, this is a little bit more of a white glove approach that you're able to provide even more services for people that are, you know, in this project with the Morehouse School of Medicine. But that it's just great because people may find out information that then they're going to pursue and learn more about. Whereas if they hadn't done this, they never started down that road and never learned about it. So you're providing people with information that they really could use before trying to conceive and having that opportunity. I mean, I'm sure the ages are all over the place in terms of people doing this, and it's useful in different areas of life. But as someone that's constantly in the prenatal realm, you know, I can't help but think, wow, as more and more people come in, and I've seen this over the years, the people bringing in 23 reports and saying, well, I am not a carrier for this. And then we have a conversation from there, and like, you looked at these conditions, do you want to look at more conditions? And they're already kind of tuned into it. I don't have to explain what it is from a baseline. So I think there's just so many great cases that I've heard of, you know, personally in my life of people doing 23andMe tests that led them to pursue healthcare and more education and, you know, either save their life or allow them more options. So I think just being able to provide this is great. Dr. Shastri, do you have anything that you're kind of thinking about in the moment?
No, I was just saying that like what you said is exactly what we heard from our partners. We've worked with advocacy groups focused specifically on raising awareness on sickle cell trait. One of them, Breaking the Sickle Cell Cycle, it's actually started by a mom who didn't know that she was a carrier, and her son was born with sickle cell disease, and, you know, it's changed her life. And so she started this foundation, this advocacy group to really raise awareness. And that's exactly what she said. She said, you know, it's best to know your status prior to conception for family planning. But despite this, sickle cell carrier testing pre-pregnancy is not routinely offered. You know, and then newborn screening occurs, but it's really like the system is so fragmented that it's really up to the individual state health departments whether they actually follow up with the families, and that leads to a lack of awareness. So there's just so much need in the system that we feel like we're hopeful that we're helping to fill through this.
And especially for a disease that is not nano rare. This is a condition that affects a lot of people. I know we're all US centric kind of minded, and that's where we live and operate and everything, but you know, obviously globally as well. But this is not an ultra rare disease. Not saying that we shouldn't be looking at the ultra rare and nano, but I think in terms of projects like this, where I think we've done episodes where we've talked about sickle cell compared to cystic fibrosis in terms of funding and everything, and that it really is surprising how much more money has gone into cystic fibrosis, which is much less common than sickle cell. And so I think projects like these are, very much needed, and it's just so great it's happening now. Would have been awesome, even 20 years ago, right? But it's like, we're here, we're doing the work now. You guys are doing the work. I don't want to take credit for that. But before we end, I also wanted to ask about the African American sequencing project. I really know nothing about this. I don't know who is better to ask to start us out on just kind of like learning about the goals and the Global Genetics Project. I mean, can you tell our listeners a little bit about this and how it ties into our conversation with diversifying genetic research?
Yeah, maybe I can start, and then
please.
Ruth, definitely jump in. And so thanks for bringing those up, Kira. So as I mentioned, our company and our team have been working over the last almost decade on this area of work, and really it's around increasing diversity within our cohort such that we can make sure that the products, the reports, the research that we do, ultimately therapeutics we develop, are relevant and benefit all people. And so as I think you and Ruth alluded to earlier in the conversation, that's only possible if the cohort that we have represents, the global population. And so these projects, the two projects that you mentioned, the Global Genetics Project and the African American Sequencing Project, both of those are sort of towards that goal. The Global Genetics Projects, it includes more than 10,000 people who've been recruited over the past 4 to 5 years. And this project recruits individuals with 4 grandparents from countries that are underrepresented in genomics research. And the idea there is to sort of like fill the gaps within our broader cohort, so that we have a reference panel that we can then use to do things like build out our reports, and actually be able to tell people that they have ancestry from these different regions. So, one great project or a feature that came out of this last year was that we were able to do an African ethnic groups update, where we were actually able to connect customers to specific ethno-linguistic groups.
I remember getting an email
Africa.
update about that. Yes.
Yeah. So that's just one example of the kind of benefit that our customers can get from a project like that. So it's really to increase coverage and provide greater benefit. So for the African American Genetic Sequencing Project, the goal there was to create a reference panel which would benefit imputation, improve our ability to do imputation. Basically, the idea there was that we wanted to do whole genome sequencing on a subset of participants, and those genome sequences would actually allow us to do better imputation such that we could find more variants of relevance. So we could do better GWAS among our African American participants. And so the way that project worked is that we reached out to a subset of our African American customers, and we asked for their informed consent to actually do whole genome sequencing on their samples. And then we did the sequencing, and then we uploaded all of those sequences to dbGaP with their consent, with the participants' consent, so that data would be available for qualified researchers everywhere.
Love the data sharing always. Like that's amazing. Ruth, anything to add to that?
No, nothing for me. That was great.
Okay. Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's awesome. And that is something that I've noticed for, as someone that has a genetics podcast, I've done a lot of these direct consumer kits and everything. And it's really exciting to see, you get that email of, oh, we've updated your ancestry. And it's not that my ancestry has changed, but it's that, 23andMe and other companies are expanding the database you have so you can pinpoint areas where, like, at one point it was like, okay, you're from Ireland, Cork, Ireland, now I'm East Cork. So it gets more specific. And, I think it still exists that mine may be more specific than someone that has more recent African ancestry. But that's something that you guys are actively working on through these projects that you're mentioning, so that someone that has that ancestry it can be as specific as mine is. That seems to be one of the goals. And I think that's fantastic that you're zeroing in on, okay, there's a disparity there, and how can we close that, and being very specific in terms of your intentions there. I think that is just awesome. This time has flown by. I do want to ask, just in terms of people that are working and wanting to contribute to diversifying the research pool that we have, what are some challenges, considerations, things that you want people to think about when heading into this? You know, anything that maybe we haven't mentioned, or something that you said earlier that you really want to highlight and have people remember. Either one of you, whoever kind of thinks of an answer first, I guess.
Anjali, I think this is probably your wheelhouse.
Happy to start, and then I'd love your input also.
Sure.
I think, one thing, I would say two things. So one is just really the importance of engagement and bringing in the community as partners in the process. So really listening up front, working in partnership throughout the process, all the way through to the publication or whatever other output there is. If it's data sharing, getting informed consent, getting feedback from participants as to their preferences, and really respecting those. I think that's paramount. And so just approaching the whole process with that level of humility, I think is really important. And then I think the second thing, and this came up in the context of our collaboration with Morehouse School of Medicine. Our collaborators talked a lot about the importance of workforce development, and really this idea of it's really important for the people who are conducting the research to be a part of the community. They're the ones who can really truly speak to those needs and preferences in a way that others can't. And so the importance of supporting training programs for diverse scientists, and so one part of our collaboration that I didn't get a chance to mention was that we are supporting 2 interns from Morehouse School of Medicine at 23andMe. So one is a Ph.D. student and one is an M.D. student, and we're really just excited they're amazing, they're terrific, we're so lucky, and then at the same time we're excited to just be able to support the next generation of diverse scientists and healthcare professionals.
Yeah, that is so important, I think, in every realm of whatever we're talking about, to have people that are in that community to be involved in the project that is happening, throughout all the different areas of genetics. Dr. Tennen, anything else to close out with?
Sure. I can just add, kind of from the product perspective, one thing we think a lot about is making sure that we are able to help people access, understand, and benefit from the human genome regardless of their ancestry, right? And so we actually do regular audits of our health reports and other reports to try to identify gaps from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, and think about how can we prioritize resources to really fill those gaps. So whether it's, improving an ancestry report, adding a new report that may cover a topic that disproportionately impacts an underserved community. So that's something that we're constantly doing, constantly thinking about, and really excited about. I think that's something that drives both Anjali and me, is kind of this connection between creating a really engaged customer base that really wants to participate in research, and then we're able to give back to them through that research and other means to provide a really meaningful product.
Yes, and they can kind of get addicting, when you're on the portal and you have different, you guys make it fun with quizzes and answer this about yourself, and it's all you're getting my informed consent, I'm putting in what I feel comfortable with sharing, but it's fun. It's kind of like doing a BuzzFeed quiz almost, of you're putting in I am not a morning person, I'm this, I'm that, and just all of this great information. I mean, data is so valuable. I think as we head into the next few years, that's just so valuable. I think especially with AI and all the things that we're beginning to be able to do. I feel like that's the buzzword for 2023 is AI. It should be the Time magazine, that should be the person of the year is AI.
Word of the year.
I'm calling it now. It's going to be AI. It's going to be a robot on the front. But anyway, I think that this is fantastic. Yeah, Dr. Sastry.
I'm just going to say one thing. We were talking about the 3-second rule. So I had one thing I wanted to tweak a tiny bit.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Let's count to 3 in your head, and then I can replace something. Yep. Go for it. Thank you both so much for coming on. This has just been such a lively discussion. I'm glad that we were able to give specific examples, especially what 23andMe is doing to impact and really influence and create this database that is much more inclusive, that really looks like the human race. And I think it's just fantastic to be able to bring in these specific examples of projects and initiatives that you're doing. And so that we're not, talking at a high level, and we're saying like, this is something that is tangible that we're doing right now. So thank you so much. And I realize more than other episodes, we have really referenced a lot of studies, referenced other episodes of DNA Today. So head over to dnatoday.com and click on this episode. Or if you're listening to this in a podcast player, scroll left on most apps so that you can see the show notes, and then you can just hyperlink. They're all in there for things that we mentioned throughout the show. Thank you both so much. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and I think we hit our points.
Thank you, Kira, so
Thanks
much
so much for having us.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for watching DNA Today. To access all of our episodes, head over to dnatoday.com. We also have a lot of bonus content on there that you can enjoy. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, guest pitches, you name it, send them in to info@dnatoday.com. We'd also really appreciate if you could take a moment to rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to the show. It really helps more nerds like yourself find the show. Also, if you like giveaways and other ways to connect with us, I recommend following us on social. We're at DNA Today Podcast. We also have a Patreon if you want to be the most level involved in the show. That's also at DNA Today Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Join us next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.